Well, everyone, I want to say a few words about Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality. The beginning, unfortunately, is just a common occurrence in human history. This happened to be something that was happening at the time he wrote this in the early 70s, and that was war and famine in Bangladesh or East Bengal. It's just another humanitarian disaster, another inhuman treatment of people by each other, but pretty common. It's just the starting point for his philosophical point. It could be any number of things. Just people dying and starving, and going through human tragedy on a huge scale. We could fill in many others that we're more familiar with, but this is just really the starting point for his philosophical argument, which is actually quite simple. I mean, it's deceptively simple, I guess. He tells us here on page 2, which is page 836, make it a little bigger. I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. So that's the first principle, is that the assumption, the premise of his argument. And he asks, do you accept this? And he says, if you don't think they're bad, then, you're have no reason to accept my argument. But most of us obviously would say that he's right, that these things are bad. Now, the next premise is more difficult for him or less obvious, where he says, my next point is this: if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. Basically, if we can prevent a bad thing from happening without having to sacrifice anything of any real importance, we should. And he thinks that's a pretty acceptable premise too, and it probably is. Um, but this is where things get a little complicated. And he gives his infamous hypothetical here at the top of the next page. An application of his principle will be as follows: if I am walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This is the application of it. The death of a child in drowning in a pond is bad. If you can prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of any comparable more importance, you should do it. So this is what I mean. He's saying, if you're passing a child drowning in a shallow pond, even if it means getting your clothes muddy, you have a duty to go and pull the child out and save its life. Right? So that's how he starts with these two principles, and then he sort of reveals his big point, which is what follows immediately after: the uncontroversial appearance of the principle just stated that if we can prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable more importance, we should, is deceptive. If it were acted upon, even in its qualified form, our lives, our society, and our world would be fundamentally changed. For the principle takes, firstly, no account of proximity or distance, and that's the big point. If you were to follow the second premise, that you ought to be willing to make sacrifices of something that's not of comparable more importance to prevent something very bad from happening, there's nothing in there about distance, proximity. So it doesn't matter if it's a child drowning in a pond right next to you, or it's a child or any human being dying in Asia or Africa or any part of the world that you could help through giving to charity. You should do it. Right? So this is why he thinks that if you were actually to follow up on the principle, which again makes no reference to proximity, no reference to whether the person in need is near to you or far from you, that you should do it. Uh, and that's why and he thinks if we were actually to follow that out, we would, the whole society, our whole world would be revolutionized, because basically what follows is that we would have to give up luxuries. That is, if we would have to, if we wanted to be consistent and follow out our principles, that If we've accepted his two principles, and we want to be consistent and not be contradict our own beliefs, have integrity, in other words, that we should give up the things of no real moral importance, which is basically luxuries. What does this come down to? Well, if you can help somebody without making a sacrifice, that's at all important. Like giving up new clothes or a new car or any car or dinner at a restaurant or something like that, something you don't really need. That if you're going to be consistent with the principles, you should do it. And I don't know, it's a big challenge, right, from Singer. That is. Now, of course, this becomes really important in John Arthur's criticism of Singer. There's two ways that Singer says we can interpret the second premise, the one that says that we ought to help if we can. One is to say that we should help unless we are sacrificing something of comparable moral importance. That's the stricter one. Or the second one, the less strict one, we should help if we are not sacrificing anything of any moral importance. The first one is stricter because if you follow it, you basically would have to give and give and give until you were at the level until you were in danger of being at the level of the person you're trying to help, which he thinks is probably the best way, but he allows that most people would not accept that. And so he allows for the more moderate version of it, which is that you should give if what you're giving is of no moral importance, right? That is, in no way represents an important sacrifice of any kind. So I mean, to apply to myself, I'm an inveterate book buyer. I mean, I just love books. I love having books. And I love the experience of buying books, going to bookstores, buying things on the internet. So I think Singer would say, well, the money that you spend on books, you could, most of those books, you could just get and read them free from the library, right? And that would not be a sacrifice of any real moral importance. You could still read the books you want to read. You would just not own them. You would borrow them from the library, right? And the money that you would save, that you would otherwise spend on books, you could use to save somebody's life or to bring them out of suffering. That would be the more moderate version. I wouldn't be required to undergo any real hardship. I would just be required to forego some luxury, the luxury of owning a nice book. So I think that's really what we're talking about in terms of the more moderate demand. So very, very challenging, very important, very famous essay from the early 70s. Peter Singer went on to become probably the best known moral philosopher in the world after he wrote this.